David had always been a man with good intentions but poor follow-through. His life was filled with half-started projects, forgotten promises, and a series of empty excuses. He wasn't a bad person, just someone who couldn't seem to take responsibility. But that trait had a devastating impact on his family. David had a beautiful wife, Emily, and 3 children, Jack, Sarah, and Lily. Together, they lived in a small town tucked away from the bustle of city life. It should have been a peaceful existence, but David's irresponsibility cast a constant shadow over their home. At the beginning, Emily had hope. When she and David were first married, they shared dreams of a bright future. She believed in his potential, in his charm, and in the promise that one day he would change, that he would live up to the lofty promises he made. They had a beautiful home in a peaceful neighborhood, and when they had their first child, Jack, Emily thought their lives were complete. But soon after Jack was born, David began to pull away. At first, it was small things. He'd say he was busy with work or that he was tired and needed time to himself. Emily understood at first, thinking it was just the stress of becoming parents. But as time went on, it became clear that David wasn't just distracted, he was absent. And it wasn't just emotionally, he was physically absent too. He started spending more time at the local bar or disappearing for hours with his friends. There were nights when Emily would cry herself to sleep, feeling alone in their marriage, but she told herself it would get better. She loved David, and she believed in the man she had married. Then came Sarah. With 2 children, Emily's workload increased. David had promised he would help, but once again, he disappeared. Emily would stay up late at night nursing Sarah, then get up early to take care of Jack, and still, David was nowhere to be found. It was around this time that Emily realized her marriage had changed, but she refused to give up on it. She tried talking to David, but each time he promised to do better, to change, but it never happened. He was simply too lost in his world to see what was happening in theirs. Lily came next, and the pattern only worsened. By this time, Emily had lost her patience. She would beg David to help, but his excuses only grew more creative. "I need a break," he would say. "I don't know how to do this." And though Emily was weary, she kept going. It wasn't easy, but she was determined to make it work for the sake of her children. They needed her to be strong. They needed her to be their rock, even if David wasn't there. But as the years passed, Emily's hope began to dwindle. The promises from David, each one broken, weighed heavier on her heart. She realized it wasn't just about the household chores or the kids. It was about the emotional connection. David didn't show up for their marriage. He didn't show up for their children. He didn't show up for her. The turning point came one quiet evening when David returned home after being gone for several days. Emily, worn out from work and from dealing with everything alone, was cleaning the kitchen when David walked in. His eyes were distant and his voice uncertain. "I think it's time for me to leave," he said, his words hanging in the air. Emily froze, her hands still on the dishes. "What do you mean?" Leave? David sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. I need to figure things out. I've been feeling lost, like I don't know who I am anymore. I can't keep living like this. I don't want to hurt you, but I think I need to leave. Emily's heart sank. She could feel her body trembling, the weight of his words crashing over her. She had always feared this moment, but she never thought it would happen. She hadn't prepared herself for it. David, Emily said, her voice breaking. We have a family. We have kids. You can't just walk away. I'm sorry, he said softly. I just don't know how to be the man you need me to be. I don't know how to be a father. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Emily standing there, stunned. For the first time in their marriage, she felt as though she didn't even know who the man before her was. David never came back that night. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Emily tried to reach out to him, but his phone calls went unanswered. He had simply disappeared, leaving her to shoulder the responsibility of raising their 3 children alone. Jack, Sarah, and Lily, who had all been excited to have their father back after he had promised to return, were devastated. The absence of their father, already so present in their lives, became even more painful. Emily had to do everything: pay the bills, take care of the house, and be both a mother and a father to the children. As the months passed, she grew even more weary. But she loved her children, and she pressed on. Jack, the oldest, was the first to feel the sting of abandonment. He was angry and confused. Every time he did something important, graduating from elementary school, winning a little league game, he would look into the crowd, expecting to see his father standing there. And every time he saw nothing. His heart would sink, and a silent bitterness would wash over him. One afternoon, Jack had a school play, and his mother had taken him in her arms, promising that she would be his biggest fan. As they walked into the auditorium, Jack felt the familiar ache in his chest. He could still remember how it used to be, how his father would always be the loudest in the crowd, shouting his name, beaming with pride. But now, that void was unbearable. He was forced to grow up quickly, helping his mom with chores, taking care of his sisters, and dealing with his emotions alone. But deep inside, a resentment began to build. He couldn't understand how his father could simply walk away. He hated him for it, for making him the man of the house when he was just a child. Sarah, a few years younger than Jack, dealt with the abandonment differently. She tried to bury her emotions. At first, she would cry at night, clutching her stuffed animal, asking her mom why Daddy wasn't around. Emily, though exhausted and heartbroken herself, would soothe her, holding her close. "He's just working, honey," she'd say. "He'll come back soon." But as time went on, Sarah grew quieter, withdrawing into herself. She would spend hours reading, sitting alone in her room. Her favorite escape became books. She devoured novels, finding solace in the lives of characters who seemed to have their lives together. On the outside, she appeared happy, but inside she was struggling. She had once been close to David, but after he left, the void he left behind became too large. She didn't know how to talk about it, so she bottled it up. The words never came. Lily, the youngest, didn't fully understand what was happening. She would ask about her father often, but Emily's answers were always vague. "He's working," she would say. "He'll be back soon." But soon turned into months, and months turned into years. Lily became a quiet child, unsure of who to trust or how to open up to others. She grew close to her mother, but a part of her wished for a father, someone who could play with her, guide her, and protect her. The weight of Emily's responsibilities was immense, but she didn't give up. She continued to show up for her children every day. But the loneliness, the weariness, it all took its toll. One evening, as Emily was preparing dinner, she found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the darkening sky. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she last spoke to David. The emptiness in her heart felt almost unbearable. She could hear the sounds of the kids playing in the other room, Jack helping Lily with her homework and Sarah scribbling notes in her journal. They were growing up, and in some ways, it felt as if they were doing it without her. That evening, Jack, Sarah, and Lily were all sitting at the dinner table. There was an awkward silence, the air thick with tension. Jack broke it first. "Mom, do you think he'll ever come back?" Jack asked, his voice quieter than usual. Emily paused, her hands resting on the edge of the table. She thought about her answer for a long moment before speaking softly, her voice filled with emotion. "I don't know, Jack, but we've made it this far without him, and we'll keep going no matter what." The years passed, and Emily continued to navigate the delicate balance between being both mother and father. Jack graduated from high school, and Sarah found a passion for photography. Lily, though still quiet, developed an intelligence beyond her years. Emily smiled at their strength. She had poured everything she had into them, and they were turning out to be good, resilient young people. But then, one day, when Jack was 26, Sarah was 22, and Lily was 18, there came a knock at the door. When Jack answered the door, he froze. There, standing on the doorstep, was a man he hadn't seen in over a decade, his father, David. He looked older, his face weathered, his hair streaked with grey. Jack's heart raced, his emotions a confusing blend of anger, disbelief, and something he hadn't expected, a flicker of hope. Maybe his father had changed. Maybe he had come back to make things right. David stood there, looking uncertain, his hands trembling slightly. "Jack, I know this is hard to understand, but I've come back. I want to make things right. I've spent years thinking about what I've done, and I've realized how wrong I was to leave. I'm sorry." Jack stared at him, his face a mask of coldness. "No, Dad," he said firmly. "You don't get to just come back after all these years. After all the pain you put us through, you don't get to walk in here and pretend everything's fine." David's face faltered. "Jack, please, just let me explain." "No, Jack shouted, cutting him off. "You had years to explain. You had years to make things right, and you chose not to. You left us. You broke Mom's heart, and you left us to pick up the pieces. We don't need you anymore." David's eyes filled with tears, but Jack didn't care. He couldn't forgive him, not after everything. "You weren't there when we needed you. You weren't there for Mom. You weren't there for us." David stood there, speechless, as Jack slammed the door in his face. Inside the house, Sarah and Lily had heard the argument. They both walked into the living room, and when they saw their father, their faces were full of anger, disappointment, and sadness. "I thought you would come back for us, Dad," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "But you didn't. You left us. We need you then, and we don't need you now." Lily, quiet as always, finally spoke. "You broke our family, and you can't fix it now." David opened his mouth to respond, but he couldn't find the words. His children were right. He had no one to blame but himself. They had learnt to live without him, and now they didn't need him. He had hoped for forgiveness, for a chance to make things right, but forgiveness wasn't something he could demand. It had to be earned, and he had forfeited that chance long ago. For a moment, the three children stood there, looking at their father. They could see the regret in his eyes, but it didn't change anything. The years of neglect, of abandonment, had built a wall between them that couldn't be broken down with a few simple words. "I'm sorry," David whispered, his voice filled with sorrow. He turned to leave, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had lost his family for good. As he stepped outside, he remembered the woman he had once loved, Emily. She had passed away a few years earlier, never knowing that David had come back. He wished he could have told her he was sorry, but it was too late. He would never get the chance to make things right with her. David walked away, his head bowed, and for the first time in many years, he understood the true weight of his actions. He had hoped for redemption, but redemption wasn't something that came easily. Sometimes the damage was too great to undo. And in the end, David understood that he would have to live with the consequences of his decisions for the rest of his life. And as the door slammed shut behind him, so did the final chapter of a family left broken and a man who could never quite find his way back.